Friends, today's lecture we enter into one of the most pivotal and important eras in the long and complex story of the Church of the East. This period is oftentimes known as the Age of the Arabs, the Arab invasions, the Islamic conquests, however it is that you want to describe this era, but it covers roughly from the early Islamic conquests of the mid 7th century to the establishment and the consolidation of Islamic rule under first the Umayyad Caliphates, then to the early Abbasid Caliphates. And this period stems from around 622 to 750. It introduced a transformation unlike anything that the Christians of Mesopotamia had ever experienced before since the rise of the Sasanian Empire in the 3rd century. Yet what makes this era so remarkable is not simply the political or the military upheaval that it introduced, right? Again, after so many years of fighting, Persia and the Eastern Roman half of the empire had weakened themselves so greatly that it allowed for this great fall of Persia and so many losses to the Byzantine Empire that later on it introduced again changes that were never seen before. But rather, what really makes this era remarkable is the adaptability, the resilience, and the creative engagement that was demonstrated by the Church of the East given its new conditions. Contrary to simplified narratives, a lot of historians would like to say that this was a period of sudden collapse for the Christians or the disappearance of Eastern Christians. No, but rather, instead, it was a period of negotiation, cultural resilience, and even flourishing intellectually, liturgically, and missionary. If we see the readings that we were assigned, you'll see that the Church of the East really used this to their advantage in a very brilliant way, and we'll see that coming forth in the lecture. So the Church not only survived the transition from Zoroastrianism to Islamic rule, but in many areas it found itself newly positioned to contribute to the intellectual and the cultural life of the Islamic world and to expand its missionary reach across Central Asia and China. Now, each of these sections builds upon the next to illustrate how it is that this era had reshaped the Church, not by diminishing it, but by forcing it to transform and reimagine its place in a very changing world, a rapidly changing world. We'll begin first by stepping back and understanding the Church of the East before Islam had arrived. Now, just a map that helps us to visualize the Arab conquests. You'll see here a map of the Umayyad Caliphate, as well as a map of the Arab conquest to help show you where it is that the Arabs had come out of the Arabian Peninsula. Muhammad was able to gather up and to unite the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, and from those great cities, Islamic cities of Mecca and Medina, he was able to conquer Persia, bring Persia down to its knees, and was able to take large amounts of land from the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Again, just another map to show just how much land that the Umayyads had conquered in the early 8th century, just to help us get another good visual. Now, again, we return to the Church of the East on the eve of Islam. To understand this seismic shift of the Islamic conquests of, again, Persia and the eastern half of the Roman Empire, we first must understand what the Church of the East looked like in the decades just prior to them. Now, by the early 600s, the Church of the East was a centuries-old institution. It was deeply, deeply rooted in Mesopotamia, in Persia, in Central Asia. It was shaped profoundly by its status as a minority community that was living within a non-Christian empire. Remember, the Persians were, again, Zoroastrian. Under the Sasanian Empire, from roughly around 224 to its foundation, to its collapse in 651, Christians had faced periodic oppression, especially during the reign of Shapur II in the 4th century. Now, the empire was Zoroastrian, and Christianity was often perceived, again, as politically suspicious because of its origins within the Roman Empire. Now, our reading from Cardinal Filoni emphasizes that this produced a Christian identity that was marked by endurance, faithfulness, and a deep spiritual intuition that was shaped by suffering. Communities learned to maintain cohesion despite pressure, to develop liturgical and monastic expressions that was not dependent on imperial favor, and to negotiate life within a non-Christian state with very, very remarkable skill. By the 6th century, persecution had largely ceased, come to an end, and the Church of the East had become a stable and politically integrated minority within the empire. Its members served as physicians, scribes, translators, merchants, judges, teachers, political officials, and this integration prepared them well for what was to come in the Arab invasions. Now, one thing we have to be able to understand is one of the defining characteristics of the Church of the East, especially on the eve of Islam, was its extraordinary intellectual culture. It was centered in particular in the school of Nisibis. Some authors call it the Harvard of the East, but in truth, it's more than that. It was a very, very, very rigorous, quasi monastic academic institution that represented the pinnacle of Syriac Christian scholarship. Students lived under monastic discipline and they studied biblical exegesis in the Antiochian tradition, the writings of Theodore Mapasuestia and other Greek fathers, logic, philosophy, linguistics, medicine, the natural sciences, rhetoric, disputation. The school was also a very, very major center for translation. Many Greek words were translated at this time into Syriac by East Syrian scholars, forming a body of literature that would soon serve as the foundation for what was later going to be known as the Islamic Golden Age. This time when it is that Islamic scholars are really getting into philosophy, something they had been excluded from. Medina and Mecca had been excluded from the wider world, but they came into contact with when they met Christian scholars. Good. Before we venture further, we need to be able to understand that right before the advent of Islam, there were some internal divisions within the Church of the East, as well as external pressures that we'll get to in a later slide. But when we speak of some of the internal divisions, we see that there were rivalries between bishops and powerful families, schisms, including the long Elisha-Narsai conflict that we had read about in our readings, competition with the Jacobite Church, what's also known as the West Syrian Church, and resentment over perceived theological or political compromises. These are some of the factors that led to the weakening of the Church of the East as Islam came onto the horizon. Now, we had heard in our previous lecture of Dr. Fastigi speaking of the early reactions to Islam, but in a nutshell, Islam emerged in the early 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula, as we had seen in our first couple of slides earlier, through the preaching of Muhammad. By the time of his death, Arabia was largely unified under Islam. Meanwhile, the Near East was devastated by decades and decades of war between the Byzantine and the Persian empires. Right? Entire regions were exhausted. Ruined farmland, depopulated cities, collapsing trade networks, and Arabs found little resistance from communities who were too broken to really fight any longer. And so the conquest of Persia from around 633 to 651, we see that Arab Muslim forces achieved a series of very, very stunning victories. We see the Battle of Qadisiyah, a decisive Arab triumph, and the fall of Ctesiphon in 637, which led to the fall of the capital, which led to the conquering of Persia as a whole, and later on the death of Yazdgerd III that led to the ending of the Sasanian dynasty in 651. Now, this conquest was not simply a military event, but a civilizational transition. The Zoroastrian ruling class had collapsed, administrative centers were repurposed, and new governors had arrived to take their positions. Yet, surprisingly, Christian communities across Mesopotamia continued functioning with minimal disruption. Churches were not destroyed, bishops had stayed, monasteries remained open. The majority of the Christian population retained their faith for decades under Umayyad rule, the first of the caliphates. And we'll see why that is in just a moment. Remember, the Umayyads, as they come onto the scene, we'll have read about this, they're more concerned with political stability than really kind of disrupting the order of things, right? And so first on their list was to convert the Zoroastrians, who were seen as pagans, but Christians were allowed to retain things, and we'll see that under the Covenant of Omar very soon. Now, Cardinal Filoni emphasizes that many Christians did not initially resist the Arab armies, and in some cases they even preferred them to the Persians or the Zoroastrians. The Zoroastrian and Persian establishment had long placed very, very heavy pressures on Christians, if we remember, including high taxation, suspicions of treason, forced labor, you name it. And there were several reasons, I think, that we can pinpoint as far as the limited resistance towards the Arab armies. The first was war weariness. After so many years of conflict, people just became simply too tired of war. The Arabs were monotheistic, seen by some as closer to Christianity than the pagan Zoroastrianism, which worshipped fire and the sun and these things. The initial Arab tax policies that were much lighter than the Persian demands, and this is partly because of limited forced conversion by the Umayyads, who, especially in early decades, Arab leaders were oftentimes more pragmatic than ideological, and their early priority was to stabilize the newly conquered lands and not to force religious uniformity, and simply there were too many Christians around them. Why convert them when you can just tax them? Lastly was a general respect within Islam for what's known as the people of the book, Christians and Jews, who were seen as people of the covenant. Now, a little bit more on this, the people of the covenant. Christians and Jews were again classified as dhimmi communities, meaning that in Western terminology, they are roughly translated as a protected peoples. And so, while not equal under Islamic law, they were legally protected and allowed to retain certain things, such as their bishops, their churches, internal ecclesiastical courts, their monasteries, and in exchange, they paid the jizya, which was a head tax, and they accepted restrictions that were codified later on in what was known as the Pact or the Covenant of Omar. So again, in exchange for all these things, they paid the jizya, which was again a head tax, as well as a haraj, which was a land tax in some contexts. There were many restrictions, however. Some included no building of new churches, no public religious displays that might be considered offensive to Muslims, and there were certain visibility requirements. They couldn't pray their prayers out loud if a Muslim were to hear it. But in practice, the enforcement varied very widely over interpretations throughout the year. Some caliphs, some rulers were much more strict on the Christians and the people of the book, whereas others were much more lenient. It really just depended. Now, from this transition of civilizations, we see that there were certain patriarchs who were crucial for the Church of the East transition from the Persian Sasanian Empire to the Islamic Empire that was beginning to form around them. The first of which is Patriarch Ishoyab II, who early on understood that the Church's survival depended on cooperation and not resistance to the Arabs. He encouraged bishops and monasteries to maintain peaceful relations with Arab governors and to avoid all entanglement in political rebellions and political unrest. His successor, Ishoyab III, reorganized diocesan boundaries, strengthened the patriarchal office, and consolidated the liturgical structure of the church, including the harmonization of three principal anaphoras, Ade and Mari, Theodore, and Nestorius. And he also helped to, again, unify many of the liturgical books of the Church of the East, one of which including the Hudra. But this helped for the Church of the East to maintain identity during this Arab consolidation, where it is the Arab empires coming together. It allowed for, again, the Church of the East to maintain this identity through the turmoil and the upheaval and the transition period. Now, one thing that we have to note is that conversions to Islam at first were, in the early centuries, mostly motivated by social and economic pressures, and sometimes not by coercion. Christians converted mainly because of the great tax that was placed upon them in the Jizya, which encouraged many to convert, especially those who were poorer. Arabic had begun to replace Syriac in government. Intermarriage um, had increased opportunities for upward mobility, favored Muslims over Christians or other minorities in the caliphate. Yet, remarkably, most rural Christian communities retain their identity due to the Syriac liturgy, the monastic networks, the strong village structures, ecclesiastical land ownership, and the deep community memory of the Church of the East. And so the Church of the East remained widespread and vibrant throughout the 8th century, as conversions again were slow and mostly due to um, those financial hardships or the lack of opportunities were among them. That was what led to the conversions, but again, not so much so under coercion. Cardinal Filoni has a section on this that was very helpful as well. Now, one of the most important developments of this period was the extraordinary intellectual exchange between Christians and Muslims. What has to be remembered is that Medina and Mecca were very far removed from much of the philosophical progress that was happening in other areas of the world, notably from the Greeks and the Babylonians and those things that come after them and the developments of them. So far removed into the desert. And so now, when it is that the Arabs come into contact with Christians of the Persian Empire as well as Christians of the Byzantine Empire, they're fascinated at how learned the Christians are, and they're hungry for this knowledge of medical texts, of philosophy texts, of historical texts, of logical texts. You name it, they're hungry for it, and they're amazed by them. And we see from the readings of certain Christian families in the Church of the East, especially the Bokhtisho dynasty, which served as physicians of the Umayyad and the Abbasid courts for decades, maybe even centuries, and they introduced advanced medical knowledge from the Greek and Syriac traditions into Islamic culture. Remember, the intellectual centers of the Church of the East were able to translate various texts from Greek, Syriac, Hebrew, Latin, and into other languages as well, such as most notably Arabic as well. And this is why it is that Christian scholars were so highly sought after by the Arabs. And so we see certain works being translated by Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Hippocrates, Greek commentators, medical texts, logical texts, first, for example, into Syriac, then into Arabic. And this process had made, again, Syriac Christians foundational contributors to Islamic philosophy, medicine, and science. We see Christian theologians who shaped Arabic thought, such as like John of Damascus, who writes in Arabic and most notably defends icons. You see Al-Takriti, who is an early Arabic Christian apologist. You see Patriarch Timothy I, who engages in theological debates with one of the caliphs, Al-Mahdi, in an amazing text. Whatever it might be, we see Christians at the forefront of the intellectual exchange, and again, very much so contributing foundationally to what's later going to be known as the House of Knowledge in the early Abbasid period. Now, Baghdad's House of Knowledge, House of Wisdom, became the intellectual heart of Asia, of the Islamic world, one of the intellectual centers of the world, and much of it was due to the intellectual exchange between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Christians and Jews teaching philosophy, translating Greek works, practicing medicine, serving as scientific advisors, commentating on certain works of philosophy. Without centuries of Syriac Christian scholarship, what most historians call the Islamic Golden Age, which would take place in later centuries, would not have developed as it did without this foundation of knowledge that was provided for by these scholars. Now, before Islam, the Church of the East had wielded political influence within the Persian Empire. After the conquest, however, Christians had lost political power. But in exchange, they had gained cultural and intellectual influence. Remember, they became teachers, doctors, translators, philosophers, cultural intermediaries. Their influence had shifted, but it did not disappear. for so long, just as the Persians had done. The caliphs had kept Christian doctors as the head physician of their family. They would employ philosophers and poets and things of that nature. So, again, their influence had shifted, but did not disappear. We must remember what Cardinal Filoni stresses, that Christian decline was a very gradual one. Communities had thrived for centuries under Islamic rule, and they maintained their villages, their liturgy, their language, their bishops, their monasteries. And in many areas, Christians remained the majority into the ninth century, as we shall see. Missionary expansion, even while under Islamic rule, began to grow. Even as they had become a minority in the Middle East, they became a majority in new fields because the Arab Empire had opened doors, and we shall see this to Central Asia, to Tibet, to Mongolia, to China. Thus, the age of the Arabs was simultaneously a time of loss for the Church of the East, but yet a time of global Christian expansion of the Church of the East, right? Never quit its missionary zeal. Now, this, I think, is probably the most surprising legacy of the age of the Arabs, of the Church of the East during this time, is that during this time of transition, during this time of a civilizational transition, the Church of the East did not shrink, but rather it expanded. Arab rule had created stable trade routes and political conditions that were ideal for missionary travel, and thus the Church of the East became not only a Middle Eastern institution, but a global one. The missionary expansion of the Church of the East during the 7th to 8th century is one of the most extraordinary, yet least understood phenomena in church history. At precisely the moment when the Islamic conquests had reshaped the Middle East, the Church of the East launched or continued missionary ventures that would bring Christianity into the Persian interior, across Central Asia, among the Turkic and Mongolic tribes, across the Silk Road, to the imperial court of the Tang dynasty in China, rather than the Church of the East retreating inward as a defensive minority. The Church demonstrated a global, outward-facing confidence that was rooted in centuries of tradition, monastic discipline, and intellectual vigor. The age of the Arabs did not hinder its missionary ambitions, but rather it helped them and facilitated them, right? The Church began to look outward as well, and never stopped looking outward. This is at the heart of the Church of the East's global story. We see that the Islamic conquests again created a massive political zone stretching from Spain to India. And this new unity, again, as we heard, had brought safer travel than under the unstable late Persian era. It revitalized trade routes that were destroyed by so many years of war, increased security for travel, for caravans, and it reduced border conflicts along the Silk Road. So that means Christian missionaries, monks, clergy, translators, and merchants had moved more freely under the early caliphates than under previous dynasties. The Church of the East had benefited immensely from this geopolitical turn of events, shall we say, and Arab rule unintentionally created the ideal conditions for long-distance evangelization. Now, the Church's identity as a non-imperial church, which was unlike Roman Christianity, the Church of the East had no attachment to an empire, had no political patronage to lose, centuries of experience of living under non-Christian rulers, and a theological outlook open to culturally diverse expressions of Christianity had made it much more adaptable and much more acceptable to non-Christian peoples that they were trying to evangelize, who have never heard of the Christian message before. Its clergy were not agents of a foreign power, and this made them less politically threatening to all those they came across. Now, as far as linguistics are concerned and cultural preparedness, the use of Syriac, the sister language of Aramaic, made translation into a variety of local languages much more easier. The church, for example, had familiarity with Persian, Sogdian, Bactrian, Middle Chinese, and other Chinese languages, Arabic, several Turkic dialects, Mongolian. Moreover, the Church of the East missionary method had prioritized a translation of Scripture, local adaptation to be able to try to be able to get people to understand through catechesis of the core beliefs of Christianity. It had set up small monastic communities. It trained indigenous clergy, and it avoided entanglements into political affairs of imperial courts, right? So, thus, at the very moment of the Islamic world, when it began to emerge, the Church of the East was very much so uniquely prepared for global mission. It did not shy away at all, but rather expanded its outreach. Now, in conclusion, the Age of the Arabs was a turning point in the history of the Church of the East. It brought a profound political change, new cultural pressures, and new challenges. Yet also, it opened new intellectual horizons, it encouraged deep theological reflection, and it facilitated unprecedented missionary expansion. The Church of the East met these challenges, as we have seen, with resilience, creativity, and great faith. It adapted without surrendering its identity. It engaged the Islamic world without losing its theological core. This era is not simply a story of loss, it's a story of transformation, of endurance, a story of global Christian influence as the missionary outposts began to spread throughout Asia, and it remains one of the most remarkable chapters in Christian history. Now, I want us to really reflect on the readings that have been posted, especially the debates between Patriarch Timothy and Caliph Mahdi. I will also be posting El-Kindi's exchange with of apologetics, but I want to focus more so later on the later Caliphate years. We'll talk again more about Timothy the First. We'll talk more about the great literature of the Church of the East that was produced during this time by great authors. And we'll speak more about the missionary outreaches in later lectures, but we'll continue on our discussion next week in our next lecture. God bless you all.